Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tim Moen Show. We're recording from the heart of darkness in northern Kazakhstan. It's the middle of winter. Things are cold. Government's imposing itself in all sorts of ways. Its tentacles are entwined everywhere. How do we untangle these tentacles? How do we find a way to live free in an unfree world? Well, I'm going to talk to someone who's an expert at this. My next guest, Mikhail Svetov, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is the most notorious Russian libertarian. This guy has organized rallies that make the trucker convoy look like small potatoes. We're talking tens of thousands of people, 60,000 people, all fighting for liberty, all protesting and rallying for liberty in Russia, in Putin territory. So I want to talk to him about how this libertarian movement has taken off in Russia, what his involvement is in that. And hopefully we get to talk a little bit about the Russian-Ukrainian war and his take on that. So please join me in welcoming Mikhail Svetov.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, you too. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You just popped on my radar. Someone that listens to my show said, you got to check this guy out. And to my embarrassment, I hadn't noticed what's going on there in Russia with the libertarian movement. And man, you're doing some great things over there. So maybe inform my audience and me a little bit about your background.
Right. So Russia used to have a very strong libertarian movement a couple of years ago before the war started and the big purge of opposition. And we were very prominent. You mentioned that I organized several rallies. The biggest one was over 60,000 people in defense of Telegram. Telegram is a very popular messaging app, encrypted messaging app in Russia. And that's actually one of the few political successes that opposition had. Before the war, we actually managed to protect Telegram, and it's still available in Russia. And right now, it's the main mean of communication in Russia, even though Twitter is banned, Facebook is banned, Instagram is banned in Russia, but Telegram works. Right? And Telegram works in part thanks to the work that I did and Libertarian Party of Russia did in 2017 and 18. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud that I organized a series of lectures, libertarian lectures all around Russia. I actually had a lecture tour similar to the one that Jordan Peterson had around the world, but I had a lecture tour from the very east of Russia from the very west of Russia to the very east of Russia. So I went from Kaliningrad to Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. I've read lectures in over 70 cities. So it's a big feat. Nobody ever did it before or after myself. So I'm very proud of that. That's one of my biggest accomplishments. And another big accomplishment that I'm very proud of for your listeners, it might be interesting. I invited Hans-Hermann Hoppe to Moscow to read a lecture. And it was actually the biggest public libertarian lecture ever held. Over 1,500 people attended. It was a huge show. It was like a rock concert. Recording is available on my YouTube channel, SVTV Official. It's in English. There are Russian subtitles, but if you speak English, you're going to understand it easily. And I also had an interview with Hans-Hermann Hoppe. And it was a thing, it was an event that was supposed to spark a series of events, but then COVID happened, and then there was this big purge of opposition in Russia that I fell victim of as well. So I'm designated foreign agent in Russia, even though I never received any foreign money. Still, after the war started, it just everyone who was critical of Kremlin became a undesirable person in Russia. So I don't live in Russia anymore. I had to leave Russia over a year ago.
Okay.
And basically, if I was to return, I'll be jailed most definitely. I spent several months in jail in total before for organizing political rallies. But if I was to return now, then it'll be game over for me.
Wow. Okay. So, do you mind telling us where you're at now, or is that are you on the hiding out from Putin?
No. I'm not that important. Okay. So, but still, right now I'm in Dubai, but I'm traveling around world, and I spent most of my time in Latin America.
That's crazy. And so, I mean, the impression we have of Putin out west here, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what your politics are as to what your impression of Putin is, right? There is a branch of populism right now that is seeing Putin as kind of a savior of an anti-globalist savior, let's say, that is
No, I know what you. This been grinding my gears, so to speak, for years, and I've been trying to break through to talk to someone from the West, from the U.S., from Canada, from Europe, to explain how wrong this idea is. First of all, Putin is not anti-globalist. He has his own version of globalism, and in the West, this person Dugin, Alexander Dugin.
Alexander Dugin,
yeah, he has his own theory of how globalism should look like, and it's called how do you call Eurasianism, basically it's called. So he has his own version of globalism, and Russia is very much an empire. So if you think that Putin is anti-globalist, you're just bonkers. So this is my first argument. And the second argument: Putin is not a savior of Russia. Just is not a champion of Western values, of traditional Western values, whatever you think they are. He's an ex-KGB agent, and his values are not rooted in Western traditionalism. His values are rooted in Bolshevism. And if you just look a layer deeper to who he really is, if you look what he done to the Russian Orthodox Church, for example. So in the West, you always see like, Putin goes to church, he must be a believer. He built this many churches, but no, these are not churches. These are occult buildings, made for worshiping something else. Just Google a temple of defense ministry that was built under Putin a couple of years ago. This is an insane feat. It's like something out of
Temple
Warhammer.
of Defense Ministry.
Yeah, it's called Temple of Defense Ministry. It's supposed to be an Orthodox church, a Christian church. But if you look at the stained glass in this church, for example, you're going to see hammer and sickle. You're going to see a red star, a communist star. You're going to see Stalin and Lenin and all the Bolsheviks within the body of church. So if you are at all a believer, if you're a Christian, this is a blasphemy. This is not something you can witness inside a church. And again, in the same building, there is a Hitler's hat who's been being kept within the church as well. So
Crazy.
This is not whatever Putin does with the church. Yes, he manipulates church. He manipulates. He uses it as a part of the government. So basically, there's no real separation of government and the church in Russia. And whatever he does with it has nothing to do with the Christianity. To me, it feels like blasphemy.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay, so you're essentially exiled from Russia for the crime of not being pro-establishment, essentially, of pushing back against some of the Russian establishment. Do I understand correctly that protests in Russia need to be government approved now?
Yes. Not just now. Now there are no protests, so you can't get a rally approved at all. But back when I was organizing rallies, it was possible. There were 2 squares in Moscow where it was possible to get a government approval. Still very difficult. And one of the reasons why libertarians were getting their rallies approved is because we were unknowns at the time. And I think a lot of people in the government saw us as a kind of spoilers to a more established opposition, in a sense that, to redirect focus from Alexei Navalny, to redirect focus from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who are much richer, who have much more influence and much more resources to organize political work in Russia. We were the only ones who were capable of organizing rallies. So that was part of our success.
And so now you're basically a victim of your own success in a lot of ways, because you created this kind of powerful cultural or political force, and obviously the regime had to quash that out. So now you're kind of in exile. But let's go back.
That's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. So. Man, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but let's start maybe at the beginning. How were you introduced to the philosophy of liberty? How did you become a libertarian? What's your background personally?
Yeah, so basically, I grew up in a very liberal family in a classical sense, but then I started noticing some discrepancies in the theory, and I started philosophizing in my blog. I started my blog very early on. I was 16 years old on LiveJournal, and I started to, like, what do you do when you're a teenager, 16 years old, interested in politics? You invent your own political theory, and that's what I tried to do for a while. And then one of the first public libertarians came to my comment section and basically said, well, you're reinventing the wheel. Whatever you're describing, it exists already. You got to read a Libertarian Manifesto for a New Liberty. You got to read Rothbard, because that's what you're looking for. And I've read Rothbard and I got hooked. So very early on, like I was 17, 18 years old when I discovered libertarianism, and I was libertarian ever since.
Right. And your English is very good. Did you read Rothbard in English, or was it a Russian
Yeah, of course.
translation?
No. It was in English, and I was lucky to study in Canada. By the way, I spent a year in Canada, and I graduated university in the United Kingdom. So that's why my English. So
oh, very good. Okay, awesome. All right. So you were introduced to this philosophy, and then how did the Libertarian Party in Russia get started? I understand it's only been about 10 years ago or something like that, or.
Yeah, so there's some misunderstanding online. People sometimes call me one of the founders of Libertarian Party of Russia. I'm not. I joined pretty much right after it was founded. So like a couple of months after it was founded. It was founded just by some friends in Moscow and St. Petersburg, students, very young people. And it was just, people talking about libertarianism. Really, it was not a proper party at the time. We became a proper party many years after, when we started to engage in local politics. So we had some elected officials. We had some officials elected who were libertarians, very local, like on the municipal level, but still it was a success. And then when I came back to Russia 6 years ago, I was living abroad for many years, and basically Libertarian Party was existing on its own. I came back to Russia 6 years ago, and that's when an actual real growth started after the rallies, after my involvement. And
Right. And I would guess that some people would wonder how in the hell a Libertarian Party emerges in Russia under this regime of Putin. But I suspect I have an idea of how it grows and how you can grow to rallies of 60,000. I was asked this, I think, by Tom Woods when I was on his podcast. How is it? What's going on in Canada? Canada, we have Justin Trudeau. It's considered far less free by most people than the US, and yet we had these giant trucker rallies and pushback against COVID mandates. And I'm guessing it's precisely because we have a guy like Justin Trudeau in office and all these restrictions, that there's this thirst and pushback for liberty. And I'm guessing it's similar there in Russia, and that's in part why you have such big rallies.
That's exactly how it works. Basically, the more dissatisfied people with the government, the more inclined they are to look for an alternative. So there's no libertarian movement in Switzerland, for example, because it's such a functioning society. We may be critical of it. There are some issues with it, but when you're Swiss, don't fix what's not broken. So, but once things get broken, and in Russia things are very much broken, you start to look for alternatives, and that's what got people interested in libertarianism, and that's why we had so much success. That's one of the reasons, and the other reason is, that's the reason. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And your protests are banned in Russia, while, we've seen something similar happen in Canada, in that, Justin Trudeau, he engaged it used to be called the War Measures Act. I think it's called the Emergency Act now, that let the government have all these extrajudicial powers, confiscate bank accounts.
I actually followed the story very closely. You don't have to explain it to me.
Right.
I have my own news outlet in Russia. It's called SVTV News. We actually covered what's been going on with the Freedom Convoy extensively. And yes, this was terrifying. I wouldn't I wouldn't equate what happened in Canada to what happens in Russia, because you just don't know how bad Russia has it right now.
Fair.
But it's definitely like, this is a point where you have to start to resist, because if you miss that point, then afterwards the resistance will become futile. So basically, it's futile to try to push back in Russia right now as it is, because you'll just get incarcerated. In Canada, it's still not that late. In Canada, you still can make a difference. So please make a difference. Listen to someone, coming from Russia, coming from a really repressive society. You're heading in the wrong direction. What happened during COVID, what happened with the Freedom Convoy, it was terrifying, and it was terrifying to look at.
And I want to get into talking about how we make a difference here in Canada. What can we do? But before I do, while I have you here, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to get your perspective on the Russian-Ukrainian war. It's being there's two sides being portrayed to us out here in the West. On one side, it's rah Ukraine. They're protecting themselves from this evil empire. Putin's all bad, all evil. Then on the other side, we see Putin as our savior against the globalist. We touched on this a little bit, and you know, the perspective, I guess, among anti-war types that I tend to favor, but I don't know if it's correct or not, is that, look, they're all kind of bad. NATO and Putin seem to be working in lockstep to crush the Ukrainian people. You know, it's a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, you know, the Soviets put missiles in Cuba, and the U.S. rightly weren't very fond of that idea. You know, NATO is essentially doing the same thing by moving into Ukraine, right on Russia's doorstep. So no wonder Putin, you know, is so upset and defending himself. What is going on there from your perspective, from someone who kind of intimately knows Putin's motives and the geopolitics there?
Well, first of all, Putin is really that bad.
Right.
Like, don't even try to glorify him. There's nothing good in him. If you lived under Putin, you would hate his regime. There's no freedom. And that's what makes me so upset about the stance that Libertarian Party of the US took recently. I understand their sentiment. I understand them not wanting taxpayers' money being spent on such a faraway war. I understand that completely. But I think you can take that stance without, you know, calling Zelensky Hitler. It just makes you look bad.
Right.
And there are so many public speeches that are done in this kind of manner, you know, calling Ukrainians Nazis. No, there was no Nazism. There was like, I'm surprised that I have to explain it to libertarians, because we used to make so many jokes about, you know, leftists calling everyone they don't like a Nazi. But now Libertarian Party of US does the same thing, and it's ridiculous. I traveled to Ukraine many times. I actually gave a lecture in Ukraine, in Kiev, about 3 years before the war. And I'm a Russian politician. I'm very much involved in Russian politics. I never tried to get myself comfortable in Ukraine like some other politicians did. So and I was welcomed with open hands, and everyone was inviting, and like, there was no Russian genocide in Ukraine. This is ridiculous as well. So this is a war of folly that was started by Putin, an unjust war, and this is just how things are. You may disagree with the Western politics. You may disagree with the American government spending money on Ukraine. I understand that. I can explain that myself. But don't make that mistake thinking that Putin is a good guy, or that, you know, Ukrainians are just as bad as Putin. I have many criticisms towards Ukraine. They have a corrupt government, dysfunctional government. They are very much brought it upon themselves, in a sense that they were not ready for the war and they didn't do good diplomacy. These are all fair questions. But when you say, you know, both of them are at fault, you know, both of them are guilty, this is when you go too far, because no, this is a Putin's war. This war was not supposed to happen, and people were not supposed to die. He did it himself alone, without the help of Ukrainians.
Right. And what is his end goal, Mikhail? Is it pushback against NATO? Is it reunifying you know, annexing Ukraine and making it part of a larger Soviet empire again? What exactly is
using Western sort of discourse? It's an imperialistic war. So he basically tries to join a territory that does not want to be part of Russia. That's what he does. The reason why he started the war is he gravely miscalculated his own ability, the ability of his army. He gravely miscalculated the sentiments among Ukrainian people. So he basically expected that he will be invited with open hands, like it happened in Crimea in 2014. So Crimean story is completely different, and we can discuss it separately. This war, because in Crimea, nobody died. When annexation happened, you can disagree that, you know, international laws should not be broken, but for libertarians, this is a not very strong argument, right? But the truth is, like, when Ukraine was annexed, nobody died. It was a peaceful transition. So it's a very political issue. But what happens now is a full-blown war. Hundreds of thousands of people died already. Over 100,000 people died, and they were like cities are razed to the ground. I've never seen images like what we saw in Mariupol, for example. This looks terrifying. So to answer your question, it's an imperialistic war, unjustified, and the reason Putin started it is because he gravely miscalculated. I don't believe he would have started it if he knew how it will pan out, but
Right.
now it's too late. He's too involved, and he hopes that he can switch tides somehow. I'm not sure he'll manage, but politics are complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't imagine this is going to do wonders for Russia's economy. I can imagine that, that the Russian people are going to suffer under this, um, ongoing war. Okay, well, that was very enlightening. Thank you for that. So, again, we try to make things so black and white and almost cartoonish in the West, right? It's like if we do it on everything. I mean, when cannabis was illegal and we had all this crazy propaganda about reefer madness and how people were going insane from cannabis, the pushback on it was almost as propagandistic, which is cannabis cures cancer and cures every disease there is. And the truth is more nuanced and somewhere in the middle, and that sounds like what we're talking about with this war. So we can say definitely Putin is the bad guy here. He's as bad or worse than any globalist that you might point your finger at. This is a war of aggression.
Because he's his own type of globalist. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
He's not as strong, so he cannot subjugate other countries as efficiently as maybe some other powers can. But his power, when he succeeds, is much more brutal, is much more vicious and terrifying.
Right. And all that can be true, Mikhail. And we can also say that maybe the West ought to stay out of this one. Maybe we shouldn't extort our taxpayers and funnel money to the war machine there. That maybe not very much good can come of that either. And maybe
this is a libertarian position, and you're absolutely right. And in my opinion, the best the West can do, especially the US, is to fix its own internal issues and become an example to follow for everyone else. Because the best thing Americans did for liberty is not waging wars against Iraq, Afghanistan, or Yugoslavia, etc., etc.
Right.
The best contribution the US did for liberty is becoming, this shining city on the hill, this example that is so good that everyone wants to follow. And I feel like the US is losing it slowly before our eyes and becoming much more like Europe. And Europe is a much less impressive example than what the US used to be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, NATO hasn't had a good track record in the past couple decades in terms of spreading liberty, let's say. The last involvement Canada, or the last conflict, I guess, Canada was involved in was Libya, where we helped Hillary Clinton bomb Libya for freedom. And of course, that's an open slave market now. When we announced that we were going to war with Libya, or we were going to depose Muammar Gaddafi, it actually inspired 2 terrorist attacks on Canadian soil. One guy shot up Parliament, killed a soldier guarding a cenotaph. Another guy mowed down 2 Canadian soldiers and killed them with his vehicle. And both of those terrorists cited, Canada's involvement in that conflict as they're motivating the hair that broke the camel's back, so to speak, the straw that broke the camel's back. That's what pushed them over the edge. So our foreign involvement hasn't been fruitful for either the countries that we're trying to supposedly help and free, or for our own citizens themselves. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit.
Just one more thing. And the same thing happened in Iraq. Iraq is in a very poor state. If you read about politics of Iraq today, you're going to see that it's really a disaster, a post-war consensus. But if we're going to talk about NATO, just keep in mind that Putin, like what he did in Ukraine, single-handedly saved NATO's reputation in Europe, at least. So Europe, there was a lot of doubt about what NATO's been doing for the past 20 years. Now Europe is firmly invested in NATO again, and the countries that border Russia, you see Finland, you see Sweden joining NATO after 60, 70 years of neutrality, and Putin managed to reset world politics in a very bad way for everyone else.
Interesting.
COVID, look, nobody has nobody has resource to talk about COVIDs and lockdown policies anymore because everyone is talking about Ukraine. Nobody is talking about track record of NATO, like what you mentioned, because now everyone sees the danger from which NATO is supposed to protect European countries. Again, you're far away in Canada, so it probably feels different to you, but I very much understand what the Europeans feel right now. And this comes 3 years after President of France, Emmanuel Macron, he said that, NATO lost its mind and is probably heading in the wrong direction. So this sentiment changed because and thanks to Putin. So when you talk about Putin being this big enemy of globalism, look at what he did and look at this huge present that he gave to the globalist movement, because the world is now much more united against him than it was just a year ago.
Right. It's almost like the two kind of need each other. NATO needs Putin, just like Putin kind of needs NATO to.
That's how government works,
yeah.
And that's why we are libertarians.
Right. Very good. Oh, so while before we leave the subject of Russian militarism, what is our risk of nuclear war from your perspective?
Well, I think you're in Canada. Canada and Europe can feel safe, at least for now. I think there is a small risk of using tactical nuclear weapons, but again, it's not going to affect anyone except people living at the striking distance of the bomb.
Right, like you say.
But sorry, I keep interrupting you.
But
one thing you need to understand about Putin, and I think this is a big propaganda win that the West had, is that they treat this war as a winnable war, as in a sense that it can be totally won. And my argument is, look at North Korea. So North Korea has been, yes, isolated, but nobody really has any means of penetrating the system because they have a dirty bomb. They don't even have a proper nuclear bomb. They have a dirty bomb.
Right.
So Putin is much more dangerous. And while I don't believe in a blown out nuclear war, I still want to caution you from thinking in terms of total victory over Putin, because it's not going to happen. Putin can be stopped. He can be pushed back, but total victory is unthinkable in the world that we live in today.
Right. Putin's getting up there in age, and I imagine that he's got a lot of people around him that are looking for signs of weakness and are ready to kind of pounce and maybe take him out or replace him. What is next? What happens post Putin in Russia from your perspective?
To be honest, I think the best bet is chaos. He doesn't have an obvious successor, and the way his system has been built in the past 10 years is it's a system of personal power. So he's basically a cornerstone of entire Putinist system that he created. So once you remove him, everyone will be after each other, and it will be a hard time.
Yeah. So it's going to be a even rougher time for the Russian people.
In my opinion, this is the most probable end to the Putin system.
Yeah.
There are other options. So maybe he will manage to name a successor, and then things will be a little bit more stable. But still, nothing good is on the horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what do we do? Things are going to hell in a handbasket, Mikhail. How do we advance liberty in our time? Is it just a matter of making more libertarians, persuading people of the principles of the non-aggression principle and property rights or something like that? Or is it more involved? Is it?
It's more involved. First of all, libertarians need to get involved in real politics, not just talking about ideology, because I feel like in the West, that's all the libertarians do. And I'm not talking about just getting elected. I'm talking about getting serious about propaganda. I'm talking about getting serious about advancing certain causes that are within our reach. So in the US, it's easier because they have more freedoms than in Europe or in Canada, for example. And I think we need to concentrate on creating at least one free society, because once there is a free society, and I already mentioned it, talking about the US being this shining city on the hill, once there is a free society, markets will work in its favor. So what basically America does, and what it did for the past 100 years, it attracted the money, it attracted the human resource. So people skilled at something, intelligent people, people who are driven, business driven, want to create something. And this was a force in itself that pushed the rest of the world towards liberty, because they couldn't compete otherwise. So once we lose that, the world will descend into Middle Ages. So I was much more optimistic about Russia just several years ago before the war, because I thought that Russia can become, a new frontier, like the kind of a new Wild West for the rest of the world if we manage to reform the system. But today, I don't see it as a viable option because of the war and the kind of shape that Putin's power takes before our eyes. So right now, I think we need to concentrate on the few free societies and make sure they remain free and make sure they become freer than they were before. Because if we lose that, everything is lost.
Right. Okay. So how do we push back against it? There seems to be that we have populism, right? That seems to be a growing movement. Seems to be a little bit all over the map, a little bit disjointed in terms of messaging and focus. And how do we kind of maybe co-opt that movement or direct it in the right direction?
I think libertarians have a great potential of seizing a populist movement, because a lot of our because first of all, we're not invested into the establishment, and because we can take so many populist positions, so we can criticize government for almost everything, because we don't want government to do much, right? We can concentrate on criticizing government for all the failures in the society, and I don't think that libertarians do that enough, to be honest. So libertarians need to become populists, and I think they start to realize that, especially looking at the Libertarian Party of the US, but they're not heading in the right direction. So they right now they just parrot conservative talking points, which is not enough to win enough of support. To even conservatives are unable to win enough of support, to get enough power to reform the country. And now here you are, a libertarian who's just parroting what they are saying. So this is a wrong direction, I think. We need to become ultra populists. I strongly believe in that.
Right.
We need to take every winnable cause and show how government ruins it for everyone. And today it's easier than ever, and it would have been much easier if it wasn't for Putin, starting the war. But it's much easier than ever because everyone saw a failure that politics of lockdowns were. Everyone saw a failure of like what happened in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, what the Trudeau did with the Emergency Act. Everyone saw the government's, showing its teeth. So this is a time to push back.
This is a time, and right now, we're doing this interview yesterday, I believe. A bunch of grocers, the head of some giant grocery chains here in Canada, were called to Parliament to explain to Parliament why they are causing food inflation. Why are they price gouging Canadians? Why are they profiteering from Canadians? And, of course, so here's a perfect populist opportunity. Yeah, we're feeling it at the grocery store right now. Things are expensive. Why is it that, how do we explain this? Well, the left is explaining it by corporate greed, as if corporations suddenly got greedy for the first time in history in the past 2 years. And that's why everything's going up in price. Of course, libertarians actually have the answer to this and can explain why prices are going through the roof. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about, like seizing those moments to be like,
yeah, seizing those moments and using them smartly? So I can invent certain situations. If we're talking about the price of goods, the best thing you can do is basically show, the producer can show that how much of the cost the taxation is actually a part of, right? So this way they'll realize. I'm not just talking about VAT, because VAT is a final tax that is levied on a final product when it's changing hands. I'm talking about all the taxation that are taken away from this from the worker's salary, that are taken from the corporate tax, etc., etc. It's a huge amount, and people just don't realize. People think, oh, I'm paying a VAT, which is, I don't know how much it's in Canada, 20%, probably something like that, and this is it. But no, then you need to add up, how much money you paid from your own salary. You need to add up how much money has been paid from the salary of the worker who worked on the item, etc., etc.
Right.
It's going to add up to like 80-90%, and people don't realize that. So this is one thing that we need to talk about more often, and I was quite effective, actually. I was using this tactic in Russia when I was talking about politics and harm that government does. Another thing is we need to talk more about freedom of association. I think that modern cultural wars are unsolvable by the government, and the only real solution is to give people freedom of association back. So basically what it means that a lot of cultural issues can be solved on municipal level, and not everybody has to live in the same kind of environment. So it's okay that in some places, you have rainbow flags, and in other place you have, churches and people living a conservative lifestyle. It's okay that in some places you have, um, drugs are allowed, for example, and in other place they are forbidden. US has like part of the reason of the US success is that it's so decentralized that you get places like Pennsylvania, with all the Mormons living there, and Amishes, living basically how they lived in the 19th century. And then you have Las Vegas, a city of thousand sins. The prostitution is legal, drugs are easily available, and they're not bothering each other. They're completely different. If you try to mix them together, if you try to push them to live together, then you'll get a cultural clash, then you'll get a social problem. But if you let them be, this is the approach that I think this is the only viable approach for solving cultural war, and we need to talk about it more, because right now, again, looking at the American libertarians, I'm sorry, I just don't know much about Canadian libertarians, so it's harder for me to use it as an example.
Fair.
But looking at the American libertarians, I noticed that they parrot conservative talking points, and that's another winning strategy for us.
Right. Well, I think what's happening in the States is that they've kind of looked at the previous couple presidential candidates in the Libertarian Party down there. You had Joe Jorgensen and Gary Johnson, and they were addressing kind of leftist talking points, right? So they were, and this was driving, those who are more culturally, I guess, right wing in the libertarian movement insane. So you had Joe Jorgensen, for example, gave at her speech, talked about how it's not enough to just not be racist. We have to be actively anti-racist. Now, that was taken out of context, and it was spun by people going, "No, this is crazy. You're caving to the woke agenda, and you're just supporting the progressive blah blah blah." I mean, I listened to her speech. I thought it was reasonable. What she was saying was, we need to be actively libertarian. We have to be actively individualist if we want to push back against government largesse. And I thought she was trying to address kind of a populist point, or at least a prevalent point that is out there, which is racism is a real issue. What's your solution to it? And she was trying to address that, but it seems like, the right definitely didn't like that. They thought, okay, well, she's signaling that she's woke and she's progressive, and that's bad.
So first of all, I just want to stress that this is it's not a modern schism. So it's not just something that started to happen with Trump's era. Let's just look back a little bit. We had the same kind of split during a Rothbard period, when you had Cato Institute splitting into Cato and Mises. So it's we basically have two conflicting schools of libertarianism, and you need to realize that it's not going to solve itself. It's not like the left is wrong or the right is wrong. The split happened very, very early on, and I didn't like Joe Jorgensen. I didn't like her speeches. I listened closely to them during the presidential campaign, and I actually sympathized a lot with Mrs. Caucus when they were getting elected. I actually wrote not I, but in my news outlet, we actually wrote a big article about why these things were happening, because similar kind of split happened in the Libertarian Party of Russia just a year before, just a year before Mrs. Caucus took over Libertarian Party of the US. So it was very similar and familiar to what I was seeing. But again, the issue is not left with the right. I think we need to talk more about freedom of association,
Right.
and it solves a lot of issues. It doesn't solve every issue, but it solves a lot of issues within libertarian movement and within the society as well. And I think a big disservice that things like Free State Project did for a libertarian movement. I love
Right.
Free State Project, but
Yeah.
I think there's a problem with that. Is that they sort of created this idea that libertarians are homogenic
Mhm.
people that
Right.
we want to live with each other, but we want
That's
to
not true. I
work
can't
with each
stand a
other.
lot of libertarians. They're terrible.
Exactly,
You know,
and we
I
need to
wouldn't want to
talk
live with
about
these
it.
people. I'd rather live with my
We,
statist neighbor than most libertarians, I mean, to be honest.
Exactly, and I actually use the same talking point in one of my lecture because we are united against the tyranny. We are united against the government, but it doesn't mean we should live together. That's not
Right.
the point. The point is we want to be comfortable neighbors. We want to live separately, at a distance from each other, being able to create our own like tiny societies, like Hoppe would call them,
Yeah.
for
Covenant
example.
communities.
Yeah, covenant communities, exactly. And we don't talk about it anymore. I feel like level of libertarian discourse is very, very low in the West today,
Right.
unfortunately.
Well, that's fair. We're getting drug into the mud, I think, by a lot of the populist, alt-right pushback, that sort of thing, right? And yeah, it's been kind of a difficult thing. Another thing is like in Canada, one of the things that took the wind out of the sail of, I guess, the Libertarian Party was the formation of a populist party called the People's Party of Canada, led by Maxime Bernier, and they're pseudo-libertarian. I mean, a lot of their points are cross over to libertarian things, but of course he wants the government doing things as well, like regulating drugs and having control over migration and different things like that. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea of closed borders, open borders. I think that's probably the wrong way to look at it. Again, it's freedom of association. Why are the people moving across this government line over in Quebec on Roxham Road pertinent to me? I live 2,000 miles away from that place. So why does it bother me? Well, it bothers me because I'm forced into association with them. How they vote affects me. When they use healthcare, it affects me. When they use the roads and everything and social services, all that affects me because I'm forced into association with them. And so, the libertarian message that I want to get out to these populists is, look, the reason we're fighting over borders is because we are forced into association with each other. Let's promote freedom of association, and then these border issues won't be a fight anymore.
Yeah, what I did when I was talking about these issues in Russia is actually I tried to validate every cultural view that I encountered. So
Right.
I didn't care if a person was a conservative, a Christian, or LGBTQ, whatever, liberal. I was saying your views are valid. And to protect your way of life, to protect your lifestyle, we need to have a system of right that allows us to freely associate, because otherwise we'll always be in conflict. Otherwise we'll always be ruining life for each other. And it worked. It worked to a surprising number of people, but you need to talk about it constantly.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And, it's one thing I try to do is meet the audience where they're at and address their concerns and show them how liberty is the answer. Okay. So you are currently right now kind of on the run from Putin a little bit. You're in Dubai. What are your next plans? What's on the agenda? What's your project, I guess, your life project right now?
Well, that's a great question. So I run this news outlet that I mentioned, which is one of the biggest libertarian news outlets in the world. I think
Right.
we're not
And
as big as Reason, obviously.
we'll put a link to that, guys,
Yeah,
down in
well,
the show notes.
unfortunately, it's in Russian, but
We'll definitely link to the Hans Hermann Hoppe lecture, which is in English, like you said,
definitely
right?
do, definitely, and to my conversation with him. I had actually two separate videos.
Nice. I'll get those links from you and put them in the show notes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to create a proper news outlet. And succeeding, fortunately, and thinking what my next move can be, because during wartime, it's very hard to do ideological politics. It's very difficult to talk about ideology because people are dying and everyone just wants the war to end. So basically there's not much I can really do. And unfortunately, for me, libertarian movement, like global libertarian movement, is so dispersed. Nobody's talking to each other. So I've been trying to get in touch with the American libertarians for over a year, and they're just not open to communication. Unfortunately, I've been trying to establish some connections, maybe to create a network, something similar to what the leftists have, for example. So leftists have international, and they always help each other, and it's so obvious, especially now, being Russian. We had some Russian politician and Russian bloggers, really, who got in the same trouble that I got, who were designated foreign agent. And there's this blogger whose name is Andrei Rudoy. He's a communist, like a Bolshevik. And basically, the moment he was designated a foreign agent, he got a special plane delivered to him from France by Emmanuel Macron's advisor. Not advisor, what's his name? Adversary. He was running for the election. Doesn't matter. So there's this big communist politician in France, and he basically rescued Andrei Rudoy from Russia after he was designated a foreign agent. And libertarians, they don't even do blogs with each other. They don't even talk like we do right now.
Right,
So
right.
This needs to be fixed, because we're gonna libertarian movement have to become global. If it's not going to become global, we're going to lose to the globalists. And it may sound like a contradiction. Hey, you're suggesting we become globalists. No, we become a global power that protects local autonomy.
Right.
So this is the direction we need to move.
That's
towards.
funny, actually. I've been talking with some of these populists lately on my show, and they're always focused on the globalists, and the globalists are controlling everything. They're getting into our cities with these 15-minute cities and smart cities. And, the problem is the globalists. And I started to think, well, how do I become a globalist for liberty? Like, how I need to get involved. So this is perfect timing. Here, listen, guys, if you are listening to this, if you're in the U.S. Libertarian Party, connect with Mikhail here. I've
Please do.
Interviewed Angela McArdle, the chairman of the Libertarian Party, before.
Okay, to be fair, we actually agreed on having a conversation with Angela. It didn't happen yet.
Okay.
But the talks are in process, so hopefully It's going to happen.
Yeah, I hope it does happen, and let me know how I can help, how we can become globalists for decentralization and liberty. I love that idea. When I was leader of the Libertarian Party here in Canada, I signed on with there was an international association of libertarian parties. I don't know how active they are or how connected they are, but I'll definitely reach out to those guys, because there are people like you that are trying to create an international network of liberty. I love that idea.
I think we should, every libertarian should strive towards that goal, because we'll be able to amplify each other's voices. That's what left does, and that's what makes them global power. They amplify each other's voices, and even like you may regard yourself, not you personally, but someone watching this show, as an anti-globalist. But the truth is, you're still talking within the kind of news frame that globalists present. So you're discussing the talking points that you get from CNN, because they have so much influence, so much power. And why they have so much influence, so much power? Because they introduce similar talking points in France, in England, in Australia, in United States, in Canada. Look what happened to, again, COVID, like lockdowns. It was not a local initiative. It was an initiative that was introduced globally in every single country. And all you had to do, and the only thing you could do is to react to it somehow, to resist. But this is much less efficient than being able to introduce your own talking points. And for that, you need to become a global power.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. So becoming a global power is the key, and it sounds like you're on your way to doing that with your media company and your news site. Hopefully you become a media empire in competition with CNN and some of these other
hopefully
it's tough, that part of the problem too is educating people that the problem with globalism is that it's statism, and so a lot of nationalism is just is just globalism on a more local level, and so while decentralization is the goal, pushing back against statism, I think, is the ultimate goal. And, we need to do that at all levels. There's, for example, just
we
local.
We need to stop playing catching up. And as
Right.
long as you just working locally, you are doomed to play catch up all your life.
Right. Well, and that's interesting because, I was talking with a lady yesterday about what's happening in some local communities here in Alberta, very rural, very small, very sparsely populated. This one community, this one county, implemented all these rules about how farmers were allowed to operate their farm, including they had to get a permit if they wanted to put up a barbed wire fence. They could only have 5 chickens unless they got a permit for more. If a shed hadn't been used in 6 months, they had to tear it down or something like that, which is just these rules that you look at them as a farmer, as a rural person, and go, these are crazy. And then when they looked at where these rules came from, well, they came from this corporation that was hired for $100,000 to consult about land use bylaws, and it was located in India, and it has all these connections to like the UN. So they're making all these connections back to the UN, and see, look, that's the problem. The UN's controlling this. Well, there's another community next to this one, has no connections to the UN, but it outlawed spitting, swearing, and dancing publicly. It's kind of like the premise of Footloose. Remember that movie Footloose, where they. So I don't care. I don't care whether it's Klaus Schwab saying I can't have chickens or just my local mayor saying I can't have chickens. That's all statism from my perspective. And
but there is a big difference, though, because once Klaus Schwab says that, you have nowhere to run, because it becomes pretty much a norm everywhere you look. When it happens on the local level, you can always vote with your feet and move, to the next city. That's why localism is so much better than globalism.
Yeah, absolutely. You get no complaints from me about that, for sure. Okay, so SVTV is where folks can find you. Well, again, I'm going to get those links for the English-speaking HOPA lectures and interviews. Post them in the show notes. Any last words of wisdom or advice for Canadians who are feeling the weight of government on them right now?
Yeah, you need to resist every single day, because once things advance towards. Sorry, I'm not. So freedom requires our defense all the time. If we don't resist government pressure all the time, then at a certain point government will become so big that it will be too late to resist. And I saw it happening before my own eyes in Russia. These kind of things happened in Europe, I would say, and I think Canada and the US are very close to that sort of red line where it becomes very difficult to advance the ideas of freedom. So you need to act now, and you need to start think globally, because if you keep playing catching up, you will keep losing. That's not a winning game. It doesn't matter how much your local government grinds your gears, unless you learn to talk to people in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Russia, in China, in India, and work towards a common goal. You will keep losing to people who manage to become a unified power. It's like in the Bible, one twig can be snapped very easily, but if you put them together, they are much stronger. And you don't need to become one solid entity, but we need to learn to work together. Otherwise, we're going to lose one by one.
We need to be a bundle of sticks. There's an English word for that. I can't remember
exactly,
what it is.
Exactly.
It shall not be named. How do we, I think I love that idea, because right now there is also a push for localism, right? It's like, okay, look, we're not going to affect these policies on a national level, but you can affect your policies at the local level within your town council and focus on that. But you're saying we need to do more of that.
This is a losing game. Yes, this is a losing game. This is basically the same kind of mentality that gets people to move and become homesteaders.
Right.
You're just postponing the inevitable. The government will come for you. Yeah, you will not be the first in line, but you will be the one who will have no reproach against the government.
So when you say we
So
need to work globally and network together, what kind of things are we talking about? Is this a battle of ideas on the world stage, or what is it?
it's a battle of ideas, but it's
Yeah.
also a battle for money, because without money you can't do anything. And the left today has so much money. And right now, look at Elon Musk, for example. He's probably the only billionaire who got who understood an ideology of freedom, and he's all alone. And look how quickly he becomes marginalized before our eyes, because there's no media that could support him. There are few media outlets, but they're not as influential as these global, liberal news networks that exist everywhere else. So we need to start working, creating media, finding our own millionaires to help us, creating our own discourses, introducing our own talking points. And like, for example, the reason why Donald Trump is so hated and Steve Bannon is so hated, because Steve Bannon is one of the few people, and I'm not saying I agree with him, I'm just commenting on his work. He's one of the few people who managed to introduce his own talking points into a global information sphere,
Right.
network, whatever you call it. But he did it by chance. He sort of managed to feel, the nerve of the zeitgeist of
Right.
the era in 2016. So he tapped into this very
Right. He saw a
successfully.
wave
But
building and caught it with the surfboard,
yes,
basically. Yeah.
exactly. But he's not capable of creating his own wave, and that's what
Right.
left does all the time, every year, one wave after another.
Mm.
And look how quickly things change.
Right.
Again, I'm not broadcasting my own ideas right now. I'm just commenting on what's
No.
going on. Look what happened to John Rowling, for example. Just 10 years ago, 15 years ago, she was a feminist icon. Today, she's a transphobe. She's almost a fascist.
Right.
And they did it in 15 years. That's a huge change. That's a
Mm.
huge change in sentiment. That's a
Right.
huge
Right.
change in sort of mind, like the kind of people, the way people think. And how did they did it? By bombarding you wave after wave, by ideology, until we create a similar system that works in
Right.
unison with each other, that
Yeah.
is capable to deliver its own message, not as a reaction, but as something that cannot be ignored. This is when we start winning.
Well, one of the problems I see with let's say conservatives or the right wing in Canada, for example, is that they're anti-Trudeau. That Trudeau is the bane of all our existence. And I continually tell these people, look, Trudeau is just he didn't create the parade, he didn't create the wave. He's just being the best at surfing it. If you want to see who's controlling Canada, look at who is controlling culture. Look at the radicals on the left that are pulling the Overton window way over the left. And this is why the Conservative Party and everyone has to have leftist talking points and talk about climate management and climate change. And my argument has always been we need our radicals up on that political stage as well,
Absolutely.
pulling things towards
I
the right.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I
No, go
actually
ahead.
gave a lecture in Colombia. I was invited to give a speech on the Libertarian Forum there. I gave a lecture in Colombia exactly talking about that in English. You can again find it on YouTube, where I was talking that libertarians need to have their own radicals, because the left will create you a reputation of radical. Does not matter what you do. Sorry, my English has gotten worse.
No, it's fantastic.
So the left will make you a radical in people's eyes anyway. Doesn't matter how tame you're trying to be. You'll always be a marginal. You'll always be a freak. You'll always you be that freaky guy who nobody listens to, unless you'll get your own radicals who will work as a shield for you. Who will make you look more tame in comparison. This is very important.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And this was my plan. I'll tell you a little story. Conservative, when Stephen Harper lost the federal election to Justin Trudeau, I think it was 2015. He stepped down, and I knew there was going to be a leadership race to replace him. And Maxime Bernier was a conservative candidate who had said a lot of things that were vaguely libertarian. I mean, he quoted Mises and Hayek, and he identified with the Austrian School of Economics. So that was very appealing. And so he's a Quebecer, and so we knew that we'd have to show him that there would be support for him in Western Canada, which is typically seen as anti-Quebec. That's the perception folks have of Western Canada. So we flew Bernier, my team and I flew Bernier out west, connected him with, fundraisers and supporters. And we wanted to show him that, look, if he threw his name in the race for conservative leader, he would be supported out west. Now, my goal here was to get this libertarian-ish guy in the Conservative Party, talking about a 15% flat tax, standing next to me, who was talking about abolishing the income tax altogether. I would be the radical for Bernier. I didn't want, because if right now in Canada, if the conservative leader were to go out on stage without a radical like me beside them and say 15% flat tax, he would look crazy. He would look like the radical. He looked like an extremist, right? But next to me, he looks like a moderate. And so that was my plan, was to get Bernier into the Conservative Party leadership. And that way I could be the radical for him, cut a swath for him, make it safe for him to talk about slightly more liberty. But we lost by 1%, and then things kind of went down.
My comment on that is that you're not radical enough. It's not enough to talk about zero taxation. This is a very pedestrian talking point.
Sure.
No, you need to have guys, like BLM, trying to incite a libertarian revolution on the streets.
I see.
Talking within the libertarian discourse. And the great thing about libertarianism is that libertarianism allows for a revolutionary discourse, and we're not talking about it at all, because basically, if government is if taxation is theft, if government is an oppressor, then the duty of every citizen, to fight the oppressor. So the moral justification is right there. We haven't seen anyone taking down the streets using that message, and there are people who are willing, and I think they're just.
Do you know who Christopher Cantwell is?
I'm not sure.
He was a radical libertarian in the U.S. I think he got arrested because of some stuff that came out of Charlottesville. He kind of went fascist, or I think he might have even identified as a Nazi. But at one point, he was a hardcore ANCAP libertarian who advocated for armed resistance. He said, unless we have freedom-loving people shooting cops, we're never going to see liberty. You need to be willing to use violence against this oppressive state. And I will debate anyone, Stefan Molyneux from Freedom Main Radio, whoever.
Defensive violence.
Yeah, defensive violence, but to him, shooting cops is always defensive, because they're,
of course,
an enemy of the state.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
right. So what you're okay? Good. This is where I wanted to go. So obviously, I'm not willing to go out there and be cannon fodder, but you're saying we shouldn't discourage.
Don't call it cannon fodder. I think again, we need to learn from the left. The left are much more savvy politicians than libertarians at the moment. And look what they do. They never condemn radicals. They always find justification. They always say, we're not like them, but these actions are justified because of this, and this. Libertarians never do that. They see something, slightly uncomfortable, someone who's called a fascist, and, well, I'm not a fascist, this guy is wrong. This guy's no, he has his own reasons. He's a radical, and it's a sad world we're living in, where people have to be radical, etc., etc. It's a different kind of attitude right now. Whenever someone is criticized by the media, whenever someone is ostracized by the liberals, libertarians always take this position. I'm not with this guy. Yes, you are. You are with this guy. He's just misunderstood. He's in a bad place right now because of the government oppression. That's the kind of attitudes mainstream libertarians need to adopt towards radicals if we ever to change things around us.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have to wrap my brain around that. You may be right. Here's where I'm feeling some resistance, I guess, is adopting the strategies of our enemies. It's almost like the means create the ends. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean, but I disagree, and I can explain
Please.
why. Because when we say that means do not just when we say that ends do not justify the means, we mean the means of violent aggression. That's the only mean that is not justified. Everything else is justified. So I just don't think that it applies to the kind of situation we're discussing.
All right. So you're saying that okay, I got you. Very good. Yeah, no, this is blowing my mind. It's making me feel very uncomfortable. I got to be honest with you, but I don't necessarily have an argument against it.
That's good.
You know, it's fair points, and you know, there may be some, I guess, tactical or strategic arguments about when you know, for example, and I asked this. I moderated the vice presidential debate for the Libertarian Party in the U.S. one year, and my question was this. I said, you know, Canada I can't remember, on some OECD index, freedom index, is actually about the same or slightly better than the U.S. Was the
That's
revolutionary?
nonsense, though.
It probably is, but I'm like, what was the Revolutionary War worth it, considering that Canada and US are roughly equal in terms of freedom? And when do you personally recommend violent revolution? And you know, I guess that's my question to you.
First of all, defensive revolution, not violent revolution.
Right, sure.
We're defending our freedom.
Violence, yeah.
Defensive violence. Second of all, these kind of statistics are absolutely bonker, like they don't reflect the reality.
Of course, yeah.
And the United States is a much freer society than Canada, and especially if you look at these statistics during the COVID era, you know, the countries that are most oppressive, like New Zealand and Australia, are the most democratic. How is it possible you have your entire nation locked under house arrest without, you know, the decision of the court for a year or more, and you call it a democracy? Well, then something is wrong with this index that you're using. So I wouldn't take them seriously at all, and I don't take this argument seriously regarding do you have to have a revolution to be free? Yes, because the United States became an example for the rest of the world thanks to that revolution, and that's what made the rest of the world change itself. You're missing the vital part. If there was no American Revolution, there would be no freedom movement in Europe. There will be no freedom movement towards freedom in Canada. We would have lived in a vastly different society today. So of course it changed. It just didn't change. American Revolution did not just change the US. It changed the entire world, and that's what's important.
The argument. I don't know if you've read Michael Malice's new book, The White Pill. He talks about how, you know, I guess the Soviet bloc dissolved relatively peacefully without violent revolution. Do you think something like that is possible in the West?
In the West, the collapse of the Soviet Union came out of nowhere. Nobody could predict it. So I think if something happens in the West, it will be just as sudden and just as unexpected. So I don't want to speculate. But just to give you another example, Soviet Union is another great example of how revolution in one country changed the world. So Soviet Revolution did not just change Russia. It changed the course of Korea. It changed the course of Eastern Europe. It changed the course of China. It changed the course of the entire world. The same kind of seismic event. American Revolution was the same kind of seismic event. It may be more difficult to trace, but it's actually was much more powerful as an event than the Soviet Revolution.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Well, Mikhail, I've kept you on here for more than an hour. This has been fascinating. I'm going to digest these points you have. I feel like I need to come up with an argument against them. I don't have one now. Maybe you may be right.
Embrace them.
Maybe I should
I've been talking about it for it years.
You know what's making me uncomfortable is I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to be. I tell you.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show. It was a great conversation, finally, with someone from the West.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to do whatever I can to get. It's an absolute crime, worthy of violating the non-aggression principle that I've only found out about you in the last couple of days. I don't know what that says about me or the media or our little microcosms of activism out west here, but something that definitely needs to be corrected, because if there's probably more people like you out there that we don't know about. We need to connect together, and we need that global force for liberty. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and it was fascinating. I'm sure we'll have you on again someday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Thanks everyone for watching. Bye.